All right, so today we're diving into something I think a lot of people are going to find super useful.
Yeah.
Improving English pronunciation,
Hmm.
which is something that I know a lot of our listeners have asked about.
Right.
And for this deep dive, we're going to be taking a look at English pronunciation and accent reduction tips, episode 3.
Okay.
And you know what? Even for native speakers, sometimes English pronunciation can feel like
Oh, absolutely.
kind of a minefield.
Yeah, it really can be. And it's interesting because English has such a rich and diverse history,
Right.
with influences from so many different languages over the centuries. And that makes it really expressive, but it also makes it, challenging in terms of pronunciation.
Well, and that's what I think is so cool about this source, is that it really seems to be focused on giving people like practical techniques
Yeah,
for speaking English more clearly, regardless of like what your native language is.
exactly.
But it makes me wonder, like, what are people's goals when they're focusing on pronunciation?
Uh-huh.
Is it always just about sounding like a native speaker?
I think that's a great question. And it's something that I think about a lot in my own work.
Yeah.
Some people do have that as a goal to like sound as close to a native speaker as possible.
Right.
But there's also a lot of people who are, maybe focusing on it for professional reasons or academic reasons where they just want to be understood more clearly.
Yeah.
And then other people, it's just about like personal confidence. They
Totally.
want to feel more comfortable expressing themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think ultimately it comes down to like, what are the individual's goals and how
Yeah.
can they feel empowered to use the language in a way that feels authentic to them?
And I love that you said empowered, because I feel like that's such a key part of it.
Totally.
Now, this source specifically mentioned the sounds oak, R, and L as common challenges for English learners.
Yeah, those are some classics.
Why are these sounds so tricky?
Well, each of those has their own kind of quirks.
Okay.
So the sound, for example, it doesn't actually exist in a lot of languages.
Right.
And it requires like a very precise tongue placement,
Yeah.
which can be really hard to get, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got the R sound, which is
Okay.
interesting because a lot of languages have an R sound, but they might be produced in different ways.
Right.
So in English, it's typically like an alveolar approximant,
Okay.
which means the tongue tip is near the alveolar ridge, but some learners might pronounce it more like a retroflex R with the tongue tip curled back.
Yeah.
And that can sound quite different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the L sound, that can also be tricky, especially for people whose native languages don't really distinguish between L and R.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, they're all fun sounds to work on.
Now, I'm curious about these shadowing techniques that the source mentioned.
Oh yeah.
Can you explain how that works and why it's so effective for pronunciation?
So shadowing is basically listening to a native speaker
Okay.
and at the same time trying to like imitate their pronunciation,
Okay.
their intonation, their rhythm.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're their shadow vocally.
Yeah.
And it's really helpful because it trains your ear and your mouth to work together.
Got it.
I actually had a student once who was really struggling with that sound that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And we used shadowing with a specific focus on M. And over time, she really started to internalize the correct placement and airflow.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was really cool to see her progress.
That's so cool. So it sounds like shadowing is a really practical approach that anyone can try.
Definitely.
So do you have any suggestions for like how people can actually incorporate it into their learning routine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, choose audio materials that you actually enjoy listening to.
Makes sense.
Podcasts, audiobooks, TED Talks, things like that.
Yeah.
And make sure the speaker has really clear speech patterns.
Okay.
And you don't need to like jump into a whole hour-long podcast episode right away.
Right.
Start with like short segments, maybe a minute or two,
Okay.
and really focus on accuracy rather than speed.
Got it.
And then as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the length and the complexity.
Okay.
And one other tip that I always recommend is to use a voice recorder.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So you can actually compare your pronunciation to the original speaker.
That's a great tip. I'm definitely going to start doing that.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems like the main takeaway is that improving pronunciation is a journey and not a destination.
Exactly.
It's not about being perfect. It's about progress
Yeah,
and feeling empowered to communicate.
absolutely.
So now that you've heard all of this, I want you to think about your own voice.
Mm-hmm.
What aspects of it do you want to maybe explore or refine?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about communicating confidently and authentically.
Yeah,
So keep experimenting, keep practicing, and remember, language is meant to be enjoyed.
for sure.